But it's very likely, in my perspective, that journalists using AI will replace journalists not using AI.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Media Coffee, a series brought to you by PR Newswire, a Cision brand. In this series, we speak to journalists and PR professionals regarding PR, corporate communication, journalism, and everything under the communication belt. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Thibaut Butin, the Director General of Reporters Without Borders. Thibaut has spent years defending press freedom, supporting journalists at risk, and creating initiatives like Journalism Initiative, Trust Initiative, Press Freedom Centers, and contributed largely to the society. Thibaut, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for welcoming me.
To start with, would you take us or would you tell us a bit about your professional journey and what brought you to focus at press freedom at RSF?
I'm a very, traditional public affairs graduate from a French university, and I've always been interested in the way we look at the world and how our perceptions are shaped. On top of my, I would say, legal political background, I also studied film, I've always been interested in fiction or journalism, in the way all these images, these narratives contribute to make us understand where we live, what are the challenges of the world. So that's very naturally that I became I would say, a militant of press freedom back in 2014. And since then, as it is a militant group, I've gone to work in different areas up to becoming the Director General in 2024. So it's a commitment. Obviously, it's not a job like any other, but it's also an organization to run. But it's also mostly campaigns to lead.
That's very interesting. And yeah, we've read a lot about your work and seen a lot of your past work, and it's commendable. Taking on to the next question, and this is at the global front. So a lot has been spoken about press freedom globally. What's your perspective? How has the state of press freedom globally changed in the last few years? What do you think about it?
But it all depends on how you define press freedom. And RSF has been always very clear about the fact that you need to both have an understanding of what a free press means and to defend it very hardly. And it is true that with time passing, with this concept that is over 2 centuries old, people might have lost what it means along the way. In RSF perspective, freedom of the press is obviously more than safety of journalists. It's an agency, a capacity for journalists and reporters to work in the public's interest, to gather, to collect, to disseminate information, news that contribute to public awakening. And that's why we have a very, I would say, rich view of what a free press means. It includes, obviously, the trust of the people. It includes the economy that enables the journalists to perform their duties. It includes a certain level of, distance from political and legal pressure, and also, obviously, safety. So the World Press Freedom Index that RSF issues every year is a way to measure the temperature. So the thermometer is not broken, but I can tell you that it's getting hotter and hotter every year. And for the first time in RSF's history last year, a majority of countries have been listed as being countries where press freedom is not achieved. That it's difficult countries that we call the red countries, because the map is a colored map which goes from yellow and green to black, and it's true that we are now facing a sharp decline of press freedom globally.
That's absolutely right. I was going through the World Press Index, which RSF is widely known for. And coming to the next question, there's also a finding that was highlighted in the report that there's a growing hostility towards journalists, and which is increasing economic pressure in the newsroom. Um, Talking about this specific point, what do you think are the challenges that journalists still face in terms of maintaining press freedom in the current world, and how is RSF supporting them, especially, to maintain press freedom in regions or areas where reliable information is restricted?
So RSF's mandate is definitely to promote journalism, to support journalists at risk, and we have three different ways to operate. The first one is to publish, to raise awareness on press freedom related violations, and the World Press Freedom Index is obviously one of the most widely known tools that we have. But we really publish on a daily basis, including in-depth investigations and reports which highlight some specific situation. The second thing that we do is that we advocate towards press stakeholders, towards policymakers, towards international organizations in order to get changes. And we talk to everyone, including repressive regimes. We really feel that it's important to engage. Only people that do not shake hands have clean hands. And the third thing that we do is that we promote and we implement programs and projects that benefit directly the journalists. We have an assistance desk that is in charge of enabling visas for journalists, giving grants to journalists in danger, enabling them to cover medical or legal costs. So all of that is something that we do in regimes where free press is not achieved. But we are seeing such a decline of press freedom globally that we have to work more and more in the United States of America, in Europe, or even within the European Union. So we're very concerned with those trends, and we think that in some cases journalists are killed, but in other territories journalism dies. And contrary to some of the mantras and mottos that we might have used too much in the past, journalism doesn't die in darkness, it dies in plain sight. The World Press Freedom Index last year really did try to put the focus on the economy of the media, which is one of the underlying issues that we have not collectively been able to solve. If journalists are not able to have sufficient funding for their activities, if newsrooms are underfunded, you can see hostile takeover. You can see a decline of the quality towards more news clicks type of clickbait kind of articles. You can also see pressure from the funders, whether they're public subsidies or advertisers. So all of that is very worrying as a trend, and we need to find ways to bring back a virtuous circle to the benefit of journalism.
That's a great answer, and I completely agree with you on it. Since RSF has a lot of initiatives, I just wanted to touch base on one of it. That's Journalism Trust Initiative, and that's the next question. How do RSF's digital releases and the Journalism Trust Initiative help readers know which sources are trustworthy or reliable and which are bots?
So the Journalism Trust Initiative, is the largest trust initiative globally for the news, and it's very interesting because when we had the idea of building such a project, we were sure that it had already been tried, that there had been prior experiences of media labeling, of standardization of the news process. The JTI works just as a fair trade label. Fair trade labels doesn't tell you that the chocolate or the coffee is good, and sometimes it's not good at all. It's disgusting, but it tells you how it's been done, how it's been produced. And we consider news production as a process. It is obviously clear that you can gather hundreds of journalists, and they probably will agree on some features of the news production. That's what we did under the ISO guidance. So it's an ISO type standard. And now newsrooms can obviously evaluate how much they are compliant with the standard, which has been established by the profession. They can be also certified based on these answers. And yes, the idea is to build a virtuous circle again. So we encourage advertisers to put back money into trustworthy news outlets. We think that private funders and public subsidies should earmark some of their funding to JTI compliant media. And we've seen repeatedly polls saying that the general public is interested in trust labels. So apparently there is a need for that. So it can also be used as a token of trustworthiness for the general public.
Coming down to the next topic, RSF has recently led Paris Charter on AI and journalism, and AI is growing massively. It's been around for a couple of years. A lot of journalists use AI or AI tools to generate information or to gather data for their stories. Now, a lot of time, and most of the time, AI generated content can be biased or inaccurate. So how does Paris Charter on AI and journalism help address these risks and promote responsible use of AI?
So we must look at the history of journalism, and journalism being, I would say, the immediate history, is always rushing to get the news out. But sometimes it prevents news executives, journalists themselves from reflecting on their own traits. And the situation we're in, which I tried to describe, with this broken economy, with the digital chaos, all of that is a result of technological changes that the press has not been able to properly tackle back in the early 2000s and 2010s. So now we're facing something that I would say generates even more anxiety within newsroom, because it's touching upon what is the core business of journalism, which is content. And you have the ability via AI tools to generate text, to generate images, to generate videos, which might look like actual content, which can also, take the place, replace actual generic content. So this synthetic content is in itself a threat. But the question is, where do we take it from here? Where does it go? And obviously, I'm not sure that journalists are going to be replaced by AI, but it's very likely, in my perspective, that journalists using AI will replace journalists not using AI. So we have to move towards a more responsible use of AI, because while some newsrooms are totally, making a point of not using AI, the propaganda people are using it. Politicians are using it. Advertisers are using it. So is there a way towards a responsible use of AI in newsroom? That's why we try to, evidence with the Charter of Paris. It has become a reference point. I was just in Czechia last year and met with some of the leaders of the public broadcaster, and they use it as a kind of basis for their own charter within their newsroom. So the idea that you have to retain human control, that you have to have proof of concept and testing of tools, that legal responsibility should remain under the control of the newsroom, that journalists can contribute or should be included in AI governance. All of that are smart, simple ideas that will remain valid in the future. So I'm very happy with the experiments that we've been able to conduct in the AI field, and also by the guidance we've been able to provide to newsroom globally.
As we said that, you probably journalists need to use AI to be in the sector because it's used by everyone. But there's also a risk with it because of increasing use of AI. AI does not really give you a direct source or does not really take you to the original news. So what is RSF's view on copyright and fair compensation for journalists and newsrooms?
So There are different ways to look at the question, and obviously RSF considers that there should be a fair compensation for the use of content for the training of AI models. In general, we are seeing similar issues with the use of journalistic content within, content aggregators, search engines, and social media. And the money given back to the press has been in many ways pocket money. And the failure of collective bargaining in most of the countries globally is very alarming. So we hope that fair compensation in the AI field can be achieved. But I have my doubts because I see the same individualistic behaviors, the same tendency of AI companies, which are basically the same companies or shareholders than the one of the previous tech revolution. So there is no reason why the media executives would have changed in some of their erratic behavior, and there is no reason to believe that there would be any change within the tech industry as well. So we might as well repeat the same problems, and that's also very worrying. So that's why we think we should reverse the perspective, and it is a problem of money for sure. But it's also a matter of the regulation of the field, the democratic safeguards in this tech field. And we're very much championing the idea of tax earmarked towards media from the revenues of tech companies, whether they are search engines, content aggregators, social media, or AI tools. It is existing in some countries. I'm thinking about Austria, for example, which has a kind of model for a public fund, which is based on contributions from tech companies. So this is not science fiction, and the way to deal with climate change is to make the polluters pay. So if we consider that there is an unfair use of journalistic content, if we consider that there is a risk, systemic risk for democracies because of the use of these tools, we might have as well make them pay by law. So look at some of the news production and policy production of the Forum on Information and Democracy, which is the sister entity of RSF, and you'll find some resources about that on their website.
Thank you for the answer. Coming down to the next topic, you did speak about digital transformation as well during this episode. But I just wanted to understand, when we talk about digital, it's the first thing that comes to anyone's mind is youth. How RSF's format, or how RSF format their reports, releases in a way that attracts the young audience or the youth, because I know that it's the most attractive segment at the moment.
My main concern as a civil society leader is the future of press freedom. How do we continue maintaining awareness, interest, concern over a 2-century-old concept? And if you look at the polls in OECD countries, for example, only 1% of the youngsters between 16 and 25 do read the news from actual news sources with paywalls or physical copies. So it means that the information, the building of your political and social conscience is based on social media largely. And that's why, obviously, while being concerned and critical of the digital space, RSF has invested a fair amount of energy and money into that space in order to spread its messages. I'm very proud that 40 years into the history of RSF, a large majority of our supporters are not journalists. A large majority of the people that show up at our events are under 40. And that is a sign of hope in itself. And one of the question that we have to answer is not necessarily a technical or tech question, but it's really largely related to the way we address youngsters. Is how do we get people back into the fight? How do we make them side with journalists? Because if you continue saying things that are true and relevant but are in many ways mantras, freedom of the press is a precondition of democracy, or any assault on journalists is a way to suppress the people's right to know. All of that is catechism if you do not have the general public siding with you. And freedom of the press can be perceived in lots of countries as a privilege for an elite, which are journalists. And we need to avoid that. We need to make it a popular fight again, just like it was in the 1960s and 70s, when journalists, after the Watergate scandal, after the Pentagon Papers, they were really backed by the people. They were perceived as not disruptors in the public conversation, but as a way to hold powers accountable. So that's why at RSF, not only do we have a strong policy and strategic ambition to invest in the digital space, but we're also repositioning press freedom as the people's right to know, as the right to reliable information for citizens, which is a human right. I don't know if press freedom is a human right. I don't think so. I think the right to reliable information is becoming one of the most fundamental human rights that people are deprived of. And that is a way to bring back people into our campaigns.
That's great. As you mentioned that, you're worried about the future of press freedom, and obviously we need to go and take a creative approach or look at the creative storytelling side. Coming to that, what's the most creative storytelling approach you've seen recently that really captured your attention or the attention of a skeptical audience?
I think fiction or fictionalizing journalism is really important. And actually, it might be a bit stupid to oppose fiction to news gathering because the material can be real, but the way you assemble it looks like fiction in some ways. There is a human involvement, there is an engagement, selection, choices made in the way news are presented or reality is presented in news production. I was very impressed by Mislav Chernov's 2,000 meters to Andrivka. I would say it's both, a kind of war movie, but it's also a documentary made by a journalist based on the experience of soldiers in Ukraine. And that gives me a lot of hope in the ability of journalists to continue finding new ways to present to the general public a war that has been dragging on. And how many war movies or war documentaries have people seen? Many. So reinventing journalism, finding new forms, new expressions, and journalism is an act of resistance, and you have to find new ways to fight constantly for the truth. So journalism is sometimes declining in some of its more traditional areas. Newspapers are selling less. TVs are not necessarily as much watched as they were in the past. So we have to look into different areas, which can be documentaries, which can be books, which can be podcasts. All of that are new ways of telling the story, of showing the added value of journalism. A journalism worthy of that name, which shares the same ethical codes and boundaries like traditional media had. But the future of the press will look differently from what we consider as press today. And to be honest, sometimes I feel that journalism of today too often looks like the journalism of yesterday. So let's create the conditions for having a socially relevant journalism production in the future.
That's rightly said when you mentioned that we need to experiment with new formats and maybe personalized content here. But what steps should newsroom take to keep journalists and their sources safe while we experiment these new formats?
So do not take passes that you cannot walk back. There is a need to experiment, but experimentation and testing should be limited in time, should be obviously associated with a reconsideration of the achievements of goals, of the risks taken, and I'm not sure that everything that's being tested is going to be working in the future. But it is important to have this search mode. It's almost a survival mode for some of the newsrooms. So let's find new ways. Sometimes some of them are shocking to the news consumers at first, but they can become a norm. And that's why we have to look at the emerging trends and get inspiration from other industries or other connecting fields. I think some of the news influencers, even though they're not journalists, are finding ways to tell the story which are relevant to observe, maybe mimic for more traditional newsrooms. So obviously it's very important to have very identified, I would say, enemies and repulsive practices, but you have also to learn from other connecting fields in order to find a proper way to continue interesting your audiences.
As you mentioned about the emerging trends, and obviously when we talk about emerging trends, influencers or creator journalists, as we tag them, always comes in our mind. So independent creator journalists, especially on platforms like TikTok, YouTube, are becoming really popular these days. Does RSF see this as a positive for the news industry, or this can be a challenge for verification standards?
It is a challenge, but it is also positive. And RSF is not a lobby of the corporations, and it's not defending journalists just like unions do. We are actually siding with journalists in many countries which are not press card holders, which are somewhat outside of the industry. I mean, we know, from experience that journalism is to be found in other areas sometimes than the traditional journalism, and that's why we should not close the door on these new ways of producing content. On the contrary, we should listen to that. We should watch it. We should maybe see if there are common grounds, and maybe assess if they're not part of the press freedom family or the free press family. Maybe they are. I got my doubts in the individual practice of producing news. I think news production is a collective effort in many ways. So there are podcaster studios, there are TikTok production that are probably fitting the requirements of a free, reliable, independent press. So let's get inspired by experiences in connecting fields. Let's welcome those in these connecting fields that are abiding by the promise of journalism.
When we talk about social media, when we talk about these new influencers, or social media and digital platform in general, it comes with a lot of online trolling and harassment, especially when it comes to reporting sensitive topics around climate change or human rights or anything that's sensitive. How does RSF support or help journalists and individual journalists or protect them, especially journalists who don't really have a big media backing or support?
So we do provide insurance, we do provide lawyers' advice, we do provide funding, we do provide training as well, and also visibility and psychological counseling to journalists at risk. And yes, we are facing an increasing amount of journalists having to silence themselves on social media or to relocate within their own country or going abroad. So we're concerned with those trends, and frankly, being a public person, whether you're a journalist or not, in the digital space has become very burdensome. Has been a lot of pushback from very negative comments and hostile actors. So, it's both a very exciting time to be a journalist, but also a moment of extreme pressure and sometimes weaponization. To be honest, I am very shocked by the hostility, the malice that people show on social media, which they would not allow themselves to be or to have in the natural daily life. Let's pay tribute to journalists that continue reporting despite being harassed on social media.
Coming to the last question, Thibaut, since we are talking about the emerging trends, and just one last bit, I wanted to understand that what's one emerging trend in journalism that isn't getting enough attention at the moment, but you think that will really matter in coming years, or say about in a year or two?
So there are, like, I would say, downward trends that we need to look into. Obviously, we have a wave of exile of journalists. Journalism in exile is becoming a norm, and journalists are kicked out of their country. Repressive regimes welcome, I would say, the exit of journalists. They're very happy to get rid of them. An entire media landscape have had to relocate in other countries. We need to be able to welcome entire news landscapes in safer environments in the future. I'm not able to guess where it's going to come from in the future, but let's be prepared to show solidarity, to find creative ways of finding visas, funding, and maintain the media lifeline of entire media landscapes. It is a trend that we have been able to evidence by figures as well. I mean, a vast majority of people that reach out to us now are people that are either already in exile or trying to get out of their country. So we should be concerned about that. The second thing, which is a more positive trend that I would like to highlight, is the fact that we too often, I think, are conservative in looking at the personalization of news. Tech tools and AI tools especially enable to tailor the news to fit the needs, the time, the skills of the readers, the consumers. And I think newsrooms should explore that, in very creative ways, because obviously, if people do not read the news, it's a matter of access, but it's also a matter of the framing of the news piece, and making it more attractive, more palatable, more adjusted to the needs is something that might be a way to continue maintaining interest. I've gone a long way myself from being very hostile to news, adaptation and news personalization. I have a tendency to consider that if the article, for example, which is, I would say, the atom of the news, is different based on who you are, you're losing some sort of public conversation, which is true. But it's also an opportunity that newsrooms should embrace. And I'm seeing this trend globally towards adaptation of the news, towards personalization, versioning of the news, being able to read or listen or watch the same news content with the same, I would say, quality in terms of news production. So that's a very interesting trend to look into.
That's a very interesting answer, Thibaut. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sharing your insight. It's been a pleasure having you on the show and speaking to you. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us and for the support. If you enjoyed today's Media Coffee, please don't forget to like, share, and spread it across your network. That helps us reach out more communicators like you. Thanks for listening.